Welcome, everyone. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and this is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. All right, this is going to be fun. So today we're going to take our first deep look into Mexican cartels. And what we're going to do is, in order to understand the current situation in Mexico, current Mexican cartels, we're going to go back and we're going to look at the history and development of Mexican cartels. And so our title today is A Brief History of Mexican Cartels. Now, a couple of caveats or introductory comments. Number one, as the title says, this is a brief history of Mexican cartels. And it by definition and by design is going to be an overview, 10,000-foot view look, if you will. There have been books. There have been miniseries, there have been movies, there have been more books, there have been articles. We could go on and on about so many different facets of what we're going to talk about today. And we will going forward. But again, today is an overview. Number two, there is a ton of misinformation out there. And it gets repeated in reputable magazines by reputable journalists. It sure shows up in movies and miniseries. We are going to try over the course of many weeks to dispel a lot of the misinformation, the wrong ideas that have been communicated over the years. And today, and as we go forward, we're going to try and rely on facts that we can prove, facts that are demonstrable. We're going to try to avoid speculation or anecdotes and just focus on the facts. And then the last thing, as I said, there are fascinating stories off of all of these things, and we're going to go into a lot of them going forward, but we're going to try and do today in a little bit more of a linear fashion. Okay, so with that, let's get into our brief history of Mexican cartels. Mexico and the U.S. have had an interesting relationship for many, many years. Mexico has sent illegal products into the United States since Prohibition, probably before that. But for our purposes, let's start our history in about 1970. And we're going to start with somebody by the name of Pedro Aviles Perez. He is the OG, if you will, of narcotics traffickers in Mexico. He was the first to use aircraft to transport marijuana from Mexico into the United States. He was one of the very first to traffic in marijuana into the United States in large quantities. And his influence was really felt in years after his passing because he was either related to and or kind of schooled and mentored many of the famous narco traffickers that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Now, he was killed in a shootout with federal police in September of 1978. Shortly after that, a lot of the traffickers that worked with him or under him moved to Guadalajara, Jalisco. Why'd they move to Guadalajara? Because it was really nice. Remember, a lot of the places they came from, Sonora and Sinaloa, were small town farming communities. Guadalajara had discos, it had nightclubs, it had restaurants, it had women. So you get a lot of them moving to Guadalajara in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, some of you may have heard of something called the Guadalajara Narcotics Cartel. I'm here to tell you it didn't exist. Okay? So put that to the side. What you had at best in Guadalajara in the early 80s was a loose affiliation of drug traffickers, many of whom knew each other, had familial relations, or grew up in similar areas. All right, they worked together when it was convenient for them. They didn't when it wasn't. But again, we don't want to call them a cartel in the common sense or the current sense of that word. For our purposes, we want to talk about three of the major players in Guadalajara at this time. Three of the major players amongst many, right? Many, many traffickers. So you had Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Felix Gallardo was also known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Gallardo had an ability through his political connections and otherwise to help manage the different cartel operations, the different narcotics trafficking operations throughout Mexico. At that time, they called it the plaza system, and this is an oversimplification, but they're different plazas. And to keep everybody happy, different arrangements had to be made, etc. Felix Gallardo had apparently an amazing ability to do that. Felix was also one of the first, if not the first, to really step in between the drug trade from South America, primarily Colombia, cocaine going into the United States. He was able to establish distribution routes and use the routes that had been established by Mexican traffickers for years to bring that in. So he really focused more on that side of the business, the cocaine side, worked with a Honduran by the name of Juan Mata Ballesteros, and again, was a little bit of the overseer of things. That can get overplayed, might have been overplayed a little bit in shows such as Narcos Mexico, but that's basically his role. Then you had Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, who was a little bit of an old school drug trafficker. He'd been in drugs for years. He'd been in drugs in Ecuador in the past, been arrested there, but had a lot of knowledge, a lot of information. Sometimes in movies and miniseries, he's portrayed as less than bright, maybe, a little bit of a cowboy, a little bit of a slobbish nature. In reality, people who've met him said he was very, very smart. He dressed well. He was almost always in a suit. A former DE agent who met with him in prison said that he was in silk pajamas when he met with them. So that's number two. Number three is Rafael Caro Quintero, by far the youngest of this group. He is attributed with having been one of the first people to really do wide-scale or large-scale marijuana plantations in the deserts of Sonora and Chihuahua. To the extent that he was one of the first, he certainly wasn't the only one. There were other players, but he's definitely the one that was most notable. So you had those three amongst a group of others in Guadalajara in the early 1980s. The next incident for our purposes in this history is 1985. February 2nd, 1985, DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena is leaving the American consulate in Guadalajara to go to his truck to go meet his wife for lunch. Truck's parked basically catty corner from the American consulate. And before he gets to his truck, or as he's at his truck, he is abducted. He's taken to a home in a residential area of Guadalajara located at 881 Lope de Vega, been referred to just as Lope de Vega. There he is tortured, he is interrogated, and he's eventually killed. Now, a quick aside. As most of you know, as I've described before, I've worked on the Camarena case since early 1990. And there's lots of things about the Camarena case that we could talk about. We can talk about the abduction. We can talk about witnesses. We can talk about conspiracy theories. We can talk about interrogations, all kinds of things. If you are interested in more about the Camarena case, will you let me know in the comment sections? So I'd love to know if that's something that people have an interest in. If it is, I can do that. I can talk about the Camarena case and keep it interesting for a very long time, but I don't want to overwhelm people with it if they're not interested. So please let me know. Okay. So February, Agent Camarena is abducted. DEA agents from across Mexico and the United States enter Mexico. FBI agents come in. Federal Mexican officers come in. And so Rafael Caro Quintero goes first to Caborca, which is part of where he grew up, and then he flies to Costa Rica. He's eventually arrested April 1985. Ernesto Fonseca flees to Puerto Vallarta. He's picked up in April of 1985. Felix Gallardo goes a little bit underground until 1989 when he's arrested. So huge upheavals in kind of the power structure and things. Felix Gallardo, when he's first arrested, thinks that he's going to be able to kind of manage, again, the plaza system and the different traffickers from prison. He later gets transferred to a maximum security prison, and it's clear that he's not going to be able to do that anymore. There's an infamous meeting in Acapulco between some of the bigger traffickers and Felix Gallardo's lawyer. The way it's portrayed is that Felix Gallardo kind of doled out territories to the bigger traffickers. I don't really think that's what happened. I think it's more a situation where, with Felix's blessing through his lawyer, the parties, the principals agreed, here's the basic territories that we're now going to control. Oftentimes it was people who were already kind of working in that area or living in that area or trafficking in that area. Some had family connections for years. So it's not quite as portrayed. But what does happen is, after this meeting in Acapulco in 1989, there's at least 4 cartels that are now kind of known, demonstrable, definable quantities that are then going to go forward and really generate that cartel system and cartel structure that we see in Mexico now. So the ones that you end up with, you have the Tijuana cartel, which is the Arellano Felix brothers. We're going to talk more about them in just a minute, but they get the Tijuana, the Baja California cartel and area. Ciudad Juarez goes to the Carrillo Fuentes family, the Juarez cartel. The Sonora corridor goes to Miguel Caro Quintero, which is Rafael Caro Quintero's brother. That one really over time ends up being less significant than the others. And then you have the Pacific Coast group, or the Pacific Cartel. Really hard to explain or really even understand exactly the timeline of when all these players came together, and precisely how it worked. But we can say that within a very short time after this meeting in 89, you had a cartel known as the Sinaloa Cartel that was principally run by El Mayo, Ishmael Zambada Garcia, a man by the name of Hector Luis Palma Salazar, and then El Chapo Guzman. Okay. So those are the original cartels. Now what I want to do is step through those major cartels and kind of give you a brief history of what happened with each of them. And we'll start with the Tijuana cartel, which again was comprised of the Arellano Felix brothers. So a lot of times it will also be referred to as AFO, the Arellano Felix organization. There were 7 brothers. Contrary to what you'll read all over the place, they were not the nephews of Felix Gallardo. Okay? We had Steve Duncan on my podcast. Steve was an investigator with the California Department of Justice, and he investigated AFO for the better part of a decade or more and says definitively they were not his nephews. They were not Felix Gallardo's nephews. Nevertheless, you had 7 brothers. You had a couple of sisters who may have had limited roles at different times. Primarily, there were 3 brothers. There was Rafael, who was the oldest. There was Benjamin, who was a little bit like the CEO. And then you had Ramon, who was a big man and was more of the hothead enforcer type. We're going to talk about this in a different episode, but there was a blood feud started between the AFO group, the Arellano Felix brothers, and El Chapo that resulted in lots of deaths, some really gruesome things, some really tragic things involving, people's wives, people's children. Very violent, very ugly. A major event that occurred because of this war was the death of a cardinal in Mexico, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. This was in 1993. What happened was the Arellano Felix brothers thought that El Chapo was going to be at the Guadalajara airport, or was at the Guadalajara airport in a certain car. Hitman went, shot up the car. It turns out El Chapo wasn't in the car, but the cardinal was. That was a turning point, in part because the national focus on the cartels, the violence of the cartels, the deaths from the cartels really came into focus. And it made the Tijuana cartel particularly, public enemies for having killed the cardinal. Okay, we talked that there was three brothers, and I do have notes here because I want to make sure I don't forget anything. So there were three brothers. Rafael was actually arrested in 1993 in Mexico, so his involvement kind of long-term was less. He was extradited to the United States in 2003. He was released and deported back to Mexico in 2008. He was later killed while at his birthday party in Los Cabos. So he had his birthday party. A hitman dressed as a clown comes in and killed him, shot him straight in the head, and then a couple of other times. There are places on social media, probably not Facebook or YouTube, but there are places that you can go and you can find the video, or a video of the clown firing the shots. So he was killed by the clown. The AFO continues to operate. The AFO, even after the cardinal is killed, but they are the focus of a lot of efforts, and you can see what happens. So Benjamin is arrested in March 2002. He gets extradited to the United States. He's in a federal penitentiary in Virginia and had a 25-year sentence. Ramon was killed in a shootout with police in Mazatlan in 2002. The remaining brothers were all either arrested or dead by the end of 2008. And for the most part, the nephews and other family who kind of survived them, took over the business in one form or another, were largely arrested by about the end of 2014. So that direct lineage almost ceases to exist by 2014. All right. The second of these initial cartels was the Juarez cartel, which really had been formed in about the 1970s. And so, again, as I said, it wasn't really that Felix Gallardo was doling out territory as much as it was just defining it and everybody agreeing on it. The initial leader of the cartel, or one of the initial leaders of the cartel, was Pablo Acosta Villarreal. Again, another one of those kind of OGs. He was killed in April of 1987. He was succeeded by two folks, Rafael Aguilar Guajardo and Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who was the nephew of Ernesto Fonseca. Very famous, right? Lord of the Skies. You've seen him in both of the Narcos series. He had extensive ties to Colombia, flamboyant, etc. He killed Guajardo in 1993, took over undisputed leadership of the cartel. He died in July 1997. He was having plastic surgery, died almost undoubtedly as a result of medical malpractice, shall we say. Story is that the two surgeons were later found buried in concrete, which I don't find hard to believe. Amado's brother, Vicente Carrillo Leyva, went into, or kind of succeeded to power. He formed an alliance with a lot of people, including El Chapo. But El Chapo, as his wont, you're going to see this, he ends up feuding with the Juarez cartel. Vicente's brother was killed in prison. Rumor was that it was on orders from El Chapo. Vicente gets arrested in October of 2014, and really there's a steady decline in the Juarez cartel from then on. Today, there is a group in Ciudad Juarez called La Linea, which is a faction of the cartel, but there are some others, including Los Salazar, which is a faction of the Sinaloa cartel, and CJNG, which we will talk about. All right. The Sinaloa cartel, we've talked about some. The Sinaloa cartel is one of the largest, most long-standing cartels anywhere, frankly. Has a long history, broad scope, very international, led now by Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo and El Mayo. We talked to, El Mayo has been in power in one form or another since the very beginning. In 2015, is that right? When El Chapo was extradited to the United States, it became a little bit of a power gap in the Sinaloa cartel. At that time, Rafael Caro Quintero had been released from prison and was still a fugitive at that point, apparently went to El Mayo and said, hey, we'd like to get back into the cartel, but we want to be in a leadership position. El Mayo said, yep, love it. El Mayo is older. His health is bad. He has diabetes. So he said, great, no problem. Apparently, Los Chapitos said, nope, we don't like that idea. That's caused a little bit of a fracture in the cartel. You have the two factions, Los Chapitos, sometimes even referred to as La Chapiza, which is a separate cartel. And then you have those loyal to El Mayo. Recent events indicate, with one caveat, that in competition with other cartels, the two sides of the Sinaloa cartel work together pretty well. It's that old thing of, I can mess with them, but you can't, that thing. Ovidio Guzman, who was one of Los Chapitos, or is one of Los Chapitos, was captured in Culiacan earlier this year. There are rumors, lots and lots of rumors, that El Mayo had him set up, or that the information that led to his arrest came from El Mayo's group. There are some people on social media who suggest that they have or have heard radio and other communications that indicate that, again, the location was given to the military by El Mayo's people. Don't know if that's true, but that's going to be something interesting to see. We'll come back to that in a minute, too. Now, after 1989, you get the cartels, these initial cartels, some other cartels developed. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about the major subsequent cartels, right? Some of which are still in operation today, some of which are in very limited operation today. So the first one we want to talk about is the Gulf Cartel, which is an old school cartel. It had done things in Prohibition, as we mentioned earlier. It started to get into drugs in the 70s and 80s. It worked with the Cali cartel in Colombia, as distinguished from kind of what Fuentes Carrillo was doing with the Medellin cartel. It had a leader by the name of Juan Garcia Abrego, who was the first drug dealer on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, a distinction. He was arrested and extradited to the United States in 1996. As happens sometimes, he left. There becomes a power vacuum. There's some factions. There's some split off. There's some internal battles. And then a man by the name of Ociel Cardenas Guillen takes power in about 1999. He then starts to recruit military people, and not just military, but like highly specialized training, like our equivalent of Navy SEALs. And he forms a new group within the cartel called Los Zetas. He gets arrested in 2003, and the cartel and Los Zetas actually split. The Zetas go off and do their own thing. They become very prominent, and the Gulf Cartel is left on its own and does a little. It just kind of peters out. It's still prominent in a couple of locations. It has factions that are either loyal to, kind of trace their ancestry to the Gulf Cartel, but as a major player, its influence is much, much less. There also was then a group called the Beltran Leyva organization, sometimes known as BLO. And it was started by the Beltran Leyva brothers. Again, one of the, in a lot of ways, the tragic nature of the cartel system is the family structure. Brothers get into it, and we saw with the Tijuana cartel, entire families basically going away. The other thing that it means, though, is that the rivalries, the feuds, they go on for forever. It's one thing to fight business wise, and it's even one thing to get violent on business. Boy, when you start cutting off people, wives' heads, or you kill kids, that's multi-generational. So Beltran Leyva, Arturo, Carlos, Alfredo, Hector, Mario, Alberto were the big ones. They had a close alliance with El Chapo. They really moved into Gulf Cartel territory when Ciel was arrested. So again, we talked about that power gap. Zetas kind of go off and do their thing. There ends up being a little bit of a gap. The BLO moved into that area. In January 2008, Alfredo is arrested, and they blame the arrest on El Chapo. Again, this guy gets into all kinds of trouble. El Chapo does. Somehow his name's always there. They thought that El Chapo double-crossed them, and as a result, Edgar Guzman Lopez was assassinated, a 22-year-old kid, in retaliation. So the bad blood between Los Chapitos, El Chapo, BLO is there. Arturo was killed by the Mexican Marines in 2006. Carlos captured 2 weeks later. Hector was captured in 2014. So there are still some factions of BLO. Some members of BLO really kind of attached to Los Zetas, again, because they moved in. So there are remnants. There seem to be more people aligned with BLO in whatever form in the United States. So there are pockets in the United States where BLO remains somewhat prominent, notwithstanding the fact that there really aren't any of the Beltran Leyva brothers working or doing that anymore. Okay, Los Zetas, we talked about them. Their first leader was Miguel Trevino Morales. He came to power shortly after the split from the Gulf Cartel. They were known for their extreme violence. Remember, we talked after the Cardinal was killed, the Mexican government, which has had a little bit of a sine wave relationship with the cartels, really got active against the cartels. And in particular, they went after two cartels heavily. They went after the Tijuana cartel, saw what happened with them, and they went after the Zetas because their violence was so grand, so well known, so outside the box. I mean, it just was a different variety. And so, as a result, the actions of the government, the actions of the military, really led to the downfall of the Zetas. Trevino Morales was arrested in March of 2015. Almost all the leadership has been arrested or killed. It's very destabilized now to the extent it exists at all. I did see somebody called them the Zetillas, which is little fragmented groups that, again, still have some lineal chain to the original Zetas. Then there's a group called La Familia Michoacana. They're a group that split from the Zetas in about 2006. There's a couple things here I love. It was founded by a guy by the name of Carlos Rosales Mendoza. He was also had somebody who worked with him and kind of co-led at different times by the name of Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, and he was known as El Mas Loco. El Mas Loco, the craziest one. He preached his organization's divine right to eliminate enemies, and it is said that he carried a Bible of his own sayings and insisted that his army of traffickers and hitmen avoid using narcotics and other things. So anyways, interesting character. Nazario was killed in about 2010-ish. At that time, many left and formed or joined the Knights Templar, which we'll talk about in just a second. For a long time, people thought La Familia Michoacana was basically gone. Then there was a new group that started showing up that talked about, or they called themselves Nueva La Familia Michoacana, sorry. So the new La Familia Michoacana. Whether that's two separate groups or not is up to dispute. I think conventional wisdom now is that it's more of a resurgence of the old group than a new group. And in fact, recent communications of things seem to indicate that the group itself isn't using the Nueva adage anymore. So for now, we're going to call them the same group. We're going to say that they have some resurgence. They are said to be heavily involved in the fentanyl trade. I read something yesterday where somebody was trying to assert that they're not as dominant in fentanyl as is said, but very, very dominant in methamphetamine. In any event, this is a new cartel that has come back and has some type of power. You had a group called the Knights Templar that I mentioned. They were in Michoacan, again, mostly remnants of La Familia in Michoacana. They were just a weird group. They had like an ethical code, very, very odd traditions and functions and things of that nature. By about 2017, their leaders were killed off, really don't exist much anymore. Again, there's going to be remnants, there's going to be groups, there's going to be splinter groups that are going to say or identify themselves as Knights Templar. But as far as a coherent cartel, they don't really exist. All right, the last one that we want to talk about is Cartel Jalisco New Generation, which is CJNG, which is a big deal. All right. They are based in Jalisco. They're headed by El Mencho. El Mencho has been around for a long time. We're going to talk about them and the Sinaloa cartel in particular in the next episode coming up, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. They were formed, and there were some internal battles. One of the things that El Mencho did and CJNG did early on is they used propaganda. They kind of came in and said, hey, you know, a lot of drug traffickers in this area, a lot of them take advantage of people. We're not going to do it, all right? We're going to be good to people. At the same time, though, they were incredibly violent, very ruthless. They have their tentacles in lots of things besides drugs. The DEA and other groups have two acronyms. So they can have DTO, which is drug trafficking organizations, and then TCO, trans criminal organizations. This CJNG cartel is really the latter. They've got their hands in lots and lots of things, including oil, espionage, extortion, you name it. They also came out as, when I said they used their propaganda, they call themselves the Zeta Killers. So they, again, were trying to say, hey, the Zetas are really, really bad. They're doing bad things to good people. We're going to help you out. We're the good guys. And in many ways, they're as bad, or at least close to as bad as they ever were. When we talk about them next time, we'll talk about somebody by the name of El Cholo, who tried to break off from CJNG and start his own cartel, ended up in a very public death, both on social media and being interrogated. And then when he was left in Guadalajara with some messages, very ugly. But CJNG is a dominant cartel in Mexico now, and a major, major player. So where does this 30-minute history put us? Where are we today? So today we have in Mexico a number of cartels, a number of remnant cartels, probably 200 to 400 gangs, splinter groups, affiliates. I've even heard them called franchisees. But as far as major cartels today, the Tijuana cartel is mostly gone, some remnants, and some suggestions that it's growing in power as it affiliates with larger groups, because that Tijuana corridor is so valuable. Again, we talked about Ciudad Juarez. You've got a little bit of the Gulf cartel in different places. Then you have La Familia Michoacana, and then the two primary groups for most of what we're going to be concerned about, Sinaloa cartel and CJNG, which are continuing to battle each other for territory. Zacatecas, the state of Zacatecas, has been the site of many battles and conflicts between the two groups. The idea is CDS has a stronghold in Guerrero, and Zacatecas is kind of that buffer. Lots of interest in what's going to happen between the two. Lots of interest in what's going to happen since Ovidio Guzman's capture. How does that affect the power structure and the dynamic of the CDS cartel as in Los Chapitos vis-a-vis the El Mayo group? Is there going to be more of a power vacuum that CJNG can walk into, or do they coalesce around a common enemy? Things to be seen. Going forward, we're going to talk about these two main cartels in our next video presentation. If you think this is at all valuable, give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe. I didn't realize subscribers are really important and really helpful. So please subscribe if you think it's worthwhile. Comments are always, always, always welcome. Suggestions. What would you like to know more about? And then again, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to know more about the Camarena case, if you think videos on the Camarena case where we can show diagrams, where we can show pictures and video would be of interest, please let me know. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena.